Welcome, wherever you are in your day or night. Take a moment to pause and settle in. You might be lying down in bed, resting in a quiet chair, or simply drifting through the last thoughts of the evening. Wherever you find yourself, let this be a space of stillness, a place for slow listening and calm wandering. You are not required to stay alert. There is no need to follow each moment closely. Let your mind drift as it wishes. Let the rhythm of history carry you gently. Your narrator is Historian Couch, and in this video, we'll explore a time not so long ago, the Victorian era, through the quiet lens of its unspoken rules. This is not a tale of empire or invention, but of manners, motions, and expectations. It is a soft descent into a world where behavior was often more important than desire, where etiquette was a kind of quiet armor, and where every glance, gesture, and garment spoke volumes, even when no words were spoken. We will move slowly through drawing rooms and dusty schools, across cobbled streets and quiet parlors. We'll listen to how people walked, how they sat, how they lowered their eyes, how they wrote their letters. And we'll discover the quiet burden and strange comfort of a life lived under the watchful eye of social order. This journey is divided into 5 gentle chapters, each one taking us deeper into the world of Victorian rules. How they lived day by day, how their lives unfolded in stages, what secrets they kept, how the classes behaved and differed, and finally, how it all began to soften and fade. Let your breath slow. Let your body sink a little deeper. You don't need to remember everything. Just imagine yourself watching, from a corner of a candlelit room, through the lace curtains of a quiet window, in a world that once was strict, strange, and softly spoken. At what time are you listening to this? If you like, share it in the comments below. Now, with no rush at all, let us begin. In the quiet morning light, before the sun crested the rooftops and long shadows spilled across the stone floors, the ritual of dressing began. It was not a moment of haste or choice, but one of order, performed in silence or in murmured instruction, often assisted by careful hands. A young woman might begin her day with the faint chill of the room against her skin, a maid gently drawing open the curtains to let in a sliver of pale light. The air would be still, carrying the soft scent of lavender water, starch, and old wood. To dress in the Victorian world was not simply to clothe oneself, but to assume a role, to bind oneself, quite literally, into place. The first layer was always linen, a chemise, plain and soft, served as the quiet boundary between body and fabric, modesty and exposure. Over it came the stays, not cruel, but firm, meant to shape, to remind, to hold. A corset was tightened, not in punishment, but as ritual, cinching the waist, guiding the spine upright. Its laces sang no sharp songs, only the whisper of fingers pulling cotton through eyelets, the patient rhythm of dressing. Petticoats followed, often 2, sometimes 3. They rustled softly with each step, like the hush of wind through paper. The skirts themselves were heavy, draped and buttoned, sometimes padded or bustled at the back. Beneath it all, boots were laced, narrow and high, with rows of tiny buttons that might take 10 full minutes to fasten without fault. Each layer added not just warmth or shape, but meaning. A glove said, "I do not touch without intention." A hat, even indoors, said, "I know where I am and whom I face." A shawl over shoulders, even in warmth, whispered of discretion. To go without these was not daring, but rude. There were no shortcuts in this ritual, only omissions, and those carried quiet consequences. Men, too, dressed with purpose. A starched collar, stiff and uncomfortable, stood high like a guard at the gates of emotion. Cravats, waistcoats, and polished shoes were not chosen for flair, but for signaling status, intent, and self-control. A gentleman might brush his coat sleeve before reaching for his watch, a gesture that meant more than time itself. The act of dressing took time, but time was part of the lesson. To rush was to misstep, to forget a button, to mismatch a glove, to allow hair to fall too freely. These were breaches not of fashion, but of etiquette. The rhythm of their lives was marked not only by clocks and bells, but by sleeves and hems, folds and silhouettes. By the time the house was fully awake, one was no longer simply a person. They were a presence, tightly laced, buttoned, gloved, and shod. Each Victorian emerged not as themselves alone, but as a role played carefully upon a silent stage. And so the day could begin, with posture tall, face composed, and garments in place. Long before the first footsteps echoed along cobbled streets, before the milkman or newspaper boy stirred from their morning rounds, the Victorian home had already begun to wake, not loudly, but with quiet precision. It began below stairs, in the servants' quarters, where darkness still lingered, and only a faint glow from a single oil lamp pushed gently against the shadows. The scullery maid was always the first to rise, her body still heavy with sleep as she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and lit the kitchen stove. Coal cracked in the hearth, and the faint scent of smoke and iron spread slowly through the walls. In this dim hour, everything moved with practiced hush. Doors were opened with care, water boiled in silence. Shoes were laid out by the fire to warm. There was no idle chatter, just the rhythm of tasks passed down, unspoken and understood. Above, the household still slept. Bedrooms remained shrouded in soft stillness, heavy curtains drawn against the early light. But servants moved with near invisibility. A maid might slip into a room, eyes downcast, to empty chamber pots or draw the blinds a single inch. A valet would press trousers without wrinkle, polish boots until they reflected the soft lamplight like a black mirror. In the drawing rooms, tables were dusted, candlesticks wiped clean of wax, every cushion fluffed and realigned to the precise angle known only to those trained in such details. The ticking of the long case clock was often the only sound, steady as breath, marking time without comment. Upstairs, the lady of the house might stir. She would not rise herself, not yet, but wait to be called, gently, by a knock on the door, followed by a soft voice. "Your tea, madam." It would be placed just so, on a tray, with a folded linen napkin, a silver spoon turned the right way, and the tiniest jug of milk never too far. Everything had its place, and everyone had their role. For the middle classes, too, the day began with quiet efficiency. Even in smaller homes, there were gestures to uphold. The fire must be laid. Slippers must be warm. Children must be washed, dressed, and made presentable before being seen. A sense of readiness, of order and composure, was expected even before the breakfast bell was heard. The rhythm of these mornings was not rushed, but it was tight. Tightly timed, tightly held, and tightly watched. There was no room for spontaneity. No moment for lingering in bed or wandering aimlessly through corridors. By the time the sun had fully risen, the home would already be polished, its occupants dressed and composed, the first meal set with formality. To any outsider, the house might seem peaceful and proper, but beneath that surface lay hours of quiet labor and exacting routine. This was the Victorian morning, not loud, not warm, but delicately held in balance. And through that balance, the entire day was shaped. By the time the family assembled for breakfast, the quiet machinery of the house had already turned for hours. Boots had been polished, linens pressed, and every object placed with silent care. Now, all was still again, waiting. The dining room held a particular hush, not emptiness, but expectancy. A poised stillness like the seconds before a clock chimes. The heavy curtains were parted just enough to allow pale daylight in, softened by the lace that edged each pane. The air smelled faintly of boiled eggs, coal smoke, and lightly browned toast. Everything had its place. Silver polished to a soft gleam, dishes arranged symmetrically, and napkins folded not just neatly, but correctly. Family members entered one by one, not rushing, not late. Children walked quietly, their hands clean, their collars straightened just moments before. Men gave slight nods, not greetings, and women adjusted gloves or sleeves as they sat. Servants moved along the edges like shadowed figures in a play, soundless except for the clink of china and the distant tick of the wall clock. Conversation, if it happened at all, was quiet and formal. One did not speak with a mouth full, nor raise one's voice. Topics were carefully chosen. The weather, a line from the newspaper, perhaps a passing comment about the day's errands. Emotions, like elbows, were not to be placed on the table. There was a rhythm to it all. Tea poured just so. A spoon stirred 3 times clockwise, never clinked. Toast buttered with restrained movements. Eggs passed politely. Each act was meant not just to feed, but to uphold a fragile structure of propriety. A sudden laugh, a spilled drink, or a raised voice would ripple through the room like a crack in glass. Even within the family, a form of distance was maintained. Affection was measured, not absent. A glance, a careful inquiry, a nod in place of embrace. These small gestures carried weight, more so than words. For the children, the breakfast table was a silent lesson. Posture mattered. The handling of a knife and fork was observed with quiet consequence. Speaking too soon, too loudly, or too freely could mean correction later and in private. The breakfast table was a classroom without a chalkboard, a theater where nothing dramatic was allowed. And yet, beneath the surface of this quiet routine, there was comfort, a kind of predictable peace. No surprises, no chaos, no sudden shifts, just the smooth unfolding of a day beginning as it always did, with calm restraint. As the last bite was taken and the final cup of tea cooled to a warm silence, the family would rise once more. Napkins placed neatly on plates, chairs pushed back without scrape or sound. No farewells, only movement. The day, properly begun, would now proceed, shaped by rules so old they no longer needed to be spoken aloud. The room chosen for writing was quiet, always quiet. A small study, or perhaps a shaded corner of the drawing room, where the morning light filtered softly through lace curtains. The writing desk stood ready, its polished surface reflecting a quill, a glass inkwell, a stack of thick paper edged in pale blue or cream. In the Victorian world, a letter was never just words. It was posture on paper, an extension of one's behavior, dignity, and social understanding. A letter might convey affection, sorrow, news, or instruction, but above all, it conveyed restraint. The act of writing began with preparation. A blotter at hand, a penknife nearby to sharpen the nib, a sheet placed just so, never askew, never carelessly touched with inky fingers. The writer sat upright, shoulders gently back, hand poised. Ink moved slowly across the page, drawn into flourishes and careful loops. The script itself was a kind of etiquette, each line evenly spaced, each capital shaped to reflect calm control. Even grief, passion, even fear was wrapped in the slow pace of the pen. A gentleman writing to his colleague would open formally, "My dear sir," and close with, "I remain, yours faithfully." A woman writing to her cousin might use, "Dearest Emily," but never allow her heart to spill too freely. To speak too much or too soon was to lose composure. Even punctuation was deliberate. A full stop conveyed finality. A comma offered pause. Exclamation was rare, too emotional, too exposed. Instead, there was gentleness in ellipses, in the slow drift of language held just at the edge of sentiment. Paper was scented, occasionally, but never strong. Stationery was sometimes personalized, monogrammed, or embossed, yet always modest. The seal, wax pressed with care, offered both privacy and elegance, a tactile signature of both presence and control. A love letter in this world was a study in self-containment. Feelings, if expressed, were veiled in metaphor, the turn of a season, the beauty of a flower, the longing suggested but not named. A declaration might take months, sent line by line across carefully spaced pages, never daring too much. It was in what was left unsaid that true feeling often resided. Letters of mourning were even more constrained. "It is with the deepest regret," began the note. The sorrow lay not in the description of loss, but in the calm that surrounded it. The grace of the wording, the measured tone, the absence of desperation. Even in mourning, one must write as though observed. To receive a letter was to step momentarily into another's life. Through the rhythm of their pen, the silence between sentences, the steadiness of their handwriting. And once read, it was not torn or discarded, but folded and placed in a drawer, to be kept, sometimes forever. In a world where spoken words could falter and gestures be misread, the letter was a space where dignity could be preserved. Its silence was its strength. It spoke gently, and only when allowed. Outside the safety of the home, in the open streets of a town or park, the Victorian individual entered another realm of silent performance. Here, one's every movement might be observed. And so, even walking, a simple human act, became a ritual shaped by invisible expectations. It began with posture. A straight spine was essential. Shoulders were to be drawn gently back, never stiff but never slouched. The head must be held at a natural height, neither lowered too much as to appear withdrawn, nor lifted too high, which might suggest arrogance. One walked with a composed air, never with haste, and never as though uncertain of one's destination. For women, the act of walking was shaped by dress as much as decorum. The layers of petticoats and heavy skirts created a natural rhythm, a gliding step rather than a stride. Shoes, often narrow and heeled, required care in each placement. Gloves protected the hands, but also signaled restraint. They were to remain folded around a parasol, or gently clasped at the waist, never flung or tugged in distraction. A lady might carry a parasol, not for weather alone, but as a tool of elegance. It was to be held at a precise angle, its tip never dragging. She would turn corners with the slightest pause, allowing space for those ahead, her pace even, never drawing attention through abrupt movement. Men, too, were governed by these quiet rules. A gentleman's walk was a blend of confidence and calm. His coat must remain buttoned, even in warm weather. His cane, if carried, was not for leaning, but for gesture. It was a companion to his walk, used sparingly and always with composure. In the city, streets bustled with the soft murmurs of foot traffic, but the Victorian walker made no noise of their own. No humming, no muttering, no bursts of laughter. Couples strolled side by side, maintaining distance. Strangers passed with only a nod. Eye contact was limited, smiles rare unless formally introduced. For children, even in play, walking was gently corrected. A child who dashed ahead or spoke too loudly might be drawn aside, reminded to hold their hands behind their back or to walk beside an adult with care. There was dignity in stillness, in quiet steps, in being unseen even when plainly visible. To run, unless in sport or danger, was frowned upon. To lean, to sprawl, to drag one's feet, these were considered signs not only of laziness, but of moral failing. The body, the Victorians believed, was an outward reflection of inner discipline. If one walked properly, one might be presumed proper within. And so, a stroll down the promenade or across the gravel of a private garden was not merely exercise, it was a form of language. Each step, each turn, each pause at a gate or glance into a shop window, all carried meaning. They did not walk to arrive quickly. They walked to be seen walking correctly. Along the rows of neat brick houses, framed with iron railings and box hedges trimmed just so, lived not only families, but the constant gaze of others. In Victorian society, neighbors rarely intervened directly. Instead, they watched, quietly, persistently, and always with expectation. Curtains twitched only slightly. Windows were rarely thrown open, but were often peered through. A figure might be seen pausing behind lace, just briefly, before fading back into the stillness of a drawing room. It was not curiosity in the modern sense, but a kind of social vigilance. The neighborhood operated not as a community of chatter, but as a network of silent observation. Every choice, from the time one took morning tea to the manner in which one tied a bonnet, could be noted. A late visitor might draw speculation. A loud voice through an open door might earn quiet disapproval. ... A woman walking alone at dusk, even in her own street, could become a whispered question behind closed doors. The gaze was not always unkind, but it was exacting. People learned to live as if always seen, even when alone. They adjusted their gait, their tone, their posture, not just in public, but at home, in case a knock came or a carriage passed. This quiet watchfulness was particularly heavy for women. A young lady's behavior might be the subject of subtle comment. Never cruel, just softly repeated. "She wears her gloves quite loosely," someone might say. Or, "I believe she walks too briskly when unaccompanied." Nothing accusatory, yet everything significant. And yet, the pressure was not reserved only for women. Men, too, were measured, not just by success or income, but by rhythm. Did he walk home at the expected hour? Did he tip his hat to the vicar? Did his lawn receive enough attention, or his boots too little polish? To defy the gaze, to live outside its expectations, was not rebellion, but social retreat. One might find themselves slowly uninvited, subtly overlooked. A lack of Christmas card here, a missed invitation there. No scenes, no confrontation, just a soft vanishing. Children grew under this pressure without understanding it fully. They were taught to nod politely to the grocer's wife, to lower their eyes to the clergyman's glance. They learned when to speak, when to be still, and most importantly, how to appear always proper, always composed. It was not all scrutiny. Sometimes the watching carried care. A neighbor might leave a parcel at the door when illness came, or send a note expressing concern, worded delicately and sealed with wax. Yet even kindness was wrapped in discretion. In this world, silence was often louder than speech, and those who mastered the art of being seen, but not scrutinized, lived more easily within it. One learned not only how to behave, but how to be perceived behaving. That, too, was a form of survival. In the heart of the Victorian home, just beyond the vestibule, and often set apart by doors meant to hush the outside world, stood the parlor, a room of calm surfaces and carefully arranged civility. Here, voices did not rise, movements were measured, and furniture was not meant for comfort, but for correctness. The parlor was where one welcomed callers, and so it was kept in a state of delicate readiness. Lace antimacassars adorned the stiff backs of chairs. Vases stood centered on polished tables, and the air carried a faint, pleasant stillness, like dried lavender, beeswax, or rosewater. Nothing too strong, and nothing out of place. In this room, every object had meaning. A well-chosen book left upon a side table might hint at taste. A piano, even if rarely played, suggested accomplishment. Embroidery draped over a frame showed feminine industry. The room was not a place of private leisure, but of public impression. When guests arrived, never too early, never unannounced, they were shown in by a servant, seated in silence, and left to wait no more than the expected few minutes. The hostess entered with a nod, never haste, and conversation began as a performance of restraint. Talk hovered in safe terrain, the weather, a recent sermon, a cousin's new child. The pace was unhurried. No opinions were stated without careful balance. One never interrupted. One never laughed too freely. In the parlor, conversation was more about rhythm than revelation. Posture mattered. A lady sat with ankles crossed, just so, her hands gently resting in her lap, or engaged in soft needlework. A gentleman placed both feet upon the floor, never stretched out, and his hands remained visible, folded loosely or balanced upon the arm of the chair. Even the act of sipping tea followed a silent code. One lifted the cup, not the saucer, and never slurped. Sugar tongs were used, not fingers. Stirring was gentle, circular, and quiet. There were moments of pause, silences between remarks, and these were not awkward. They were part of the room's rhythm, an acknowledgement that not all needed to be filled with sound. Children, if present, were expected to be near invisible, heard only when addressed, seated without wriggling, and never speaking out of turn. To be invited into the parlor was a quiet test of maturity. For many, the parlor was not a place of rest, but of performance. Even among family, the rules remained. One did not drape, one did not sprawl, one remained composed. And yet, in its quiet, the parlor offered a certain peace, a rhythm of order, a space in which things were always the same. The ticking of the mantel clock, the clink of a teaspoon, the faint rustle of skirts. Within those moments, one might find a peculiar kind of comfort. It was not the comfort of softness, but of structure. The reassurance that here, in this room, all things had their proper place. It was more than a beverage. It was a ritual, quiet, fragrant, and gently binding. In Victorian life, tea was not simply poured. It was performed. And within this small ceremony, the rules of society were played out with delicate precision. The tea table was usually placed in the parlor or drawing room, arranged in advance with polished care. A cloth, often white or pastel, was laid without crease. China cups were matched to saucers, each thin-lipped and fine. The teapot itself stood like a sentinel, tall, often floral, warmed before use to prevent cracking from heat. Nearby sat a small dish of sugar cubes, a pot of milk or cream, and a small pair of tongs, polished until they reflected light like water. When tea was served, it was the hostess, and only the hostess, who poured. To offer the teapot to another was a quiet breach of etiquette. Her movements were observed but never mentioned. The tilt of the pot, the angle of her wrist, the time allowed for steeping. Too strong a pour was impolite, too weak, inattentive. Guests were served according to seniority. No guest helped themselves unless directly invited. Milk was added after the tea, never before. To do otherwise was considered common, even vulgar. Sugar, if desired, was chosen with the tongs and stirred gently, not noisily, never clinking against the cup's sides. Silence, even in gesture, was a sign of refinement. Conversation during tea was light, predictable, and pleasing. Compliments about the china, inquiries into the guest's health, and mild weather remarks flowed like the tea itself, warm and without rush. Anything too bold, too personal, or too humorous was quietly set aside. There was a language in how one held the cup, with fingers pinched at the handle, never looped through it. One's pinky was never extended. That, too, was a misconception. A napkin rested on the lap, and crumbs were brushed away with gentle care. To place the spoon in one's mouth, rather than use it solely for stirring, was a small but sharp misstep. Biscuits, scones, and cakes might be offered, always with a server, never by hand. A guest accepted modestly, declined gracefully, and never reached across the table. The balance between abundance and restraint was constantly maintained. One might have two, but rarely three. and never too quickly. For many, afternoon tea offered a moment of stillness. It was a pause between obligations, a breath of softness in a day of structure. Yet even within that stillness, the framework of conduct remained, a quiet reassurance that all was well, so long as the rhythm was preserved. Children were sometimes permitted to observe, seated slightly apart, offered a weaker brew or warm milk in a smaller cup. From these early exposures, they learned the quiet choreography, how to pass, how to stir, how to speak without speaking too much. In the Victorian world, tea was a comfort, but more than that, it was a code, gently spoken, never broken, and always steeped in the soothing certainty of order. From the moment they could walk steadily, Victorian children entered a world of quiet expectations. Their days were not built for play alone, but for shaping, gently, repeatedly, and often without words. Correction, in this world, was not loud or harsh. It was constant, almost invisible, sewn into the rhythm of each hour. A child might rise early, the nursery still dusky with the fading night. Their clothes would be laid out with care, and they would be dressed not in whimsy, but in miniature formality. Buttoned boots, stiff collars, pinafores tied neatly at the waist. Even in smallness, appearance mattered. A rumpled sock could earn a look. An untucked shirt might require a pause and a soft reminder. The first correction of the day might come at breakfast, a reminder to sit straight, to chew quietly, to pass the salt rather than reach. The rules were simple, but they filled the entire space of a child's world. How to fold one's hands, when to speak, where to look. These were lessons taught, not in classrooms, but in the quiet glances of adults. In wealthier homes, a governess might oversee the morning. Lessons were conducted with patient discipline. The slate must be clean before each new sum. The copybook's lines must be straight and evenly spaced. A dropped pencil was not a failure, but bending to retrieve it too hastily might be. Slowness was prized over spontaneity, calm over curiosity. When at leisure, if leisure came, the child was expected to remain composed. Games were permitted, but not the noisy kind. Dolls were dressed and undressed with care. Toy soldiers stood in formation. Books were read aloud, not devoured. And always there was a presence nearby, a nurse, a maid, a governess, who corrected without raising her voice. Even affection was measured. A hug might be allowed in private, but not in the drawing room. Children were kissed at bedtime, but rarely in front of guests. They were loved, yes, deeply in many cases, but they were shaped first. To grow without structure was thought to be a danger, one that could twist the future. Outside the home, rules followed. At church, children stood still, hands folded. On the street, they offered a bow or a curtsy when addressed. In school, they learned their place, not only among peers, but within society itself. The idea was not to shine too brightly, but to reflect the values impressed upon them, like soft wax beneath a signet ring. Correction in its gentlest form was protection. A child who followed the rules would avoid shame. A child who mastered stillness would be praised. And slowly, these little acts of pausing, of adjusting, of yielding, became instinct. By evening, a child might not even notice they were being shaped. But the shaping continued in how they held their spoon, how they folded their nightgown, how they murmured good night without prompting. In time, the rules would become theirs, and what began as correction would settle quietly into habit. As the final light of day faded behind lace-curtained windows, the Victorian home did not slow all at once, but dimmed gently, like a candle snuffed with care. The evening was not a time for disorder or indulgence. It was a time for closure, for routine, and for a composed return to quiet. The dining room, once lit with soft glow from gas lamps or flickering candlelight, now fell into stillness. Plates were cleared without fuss. Cutlery was returned to sideboards lined with velvet. Voices that had stayed calm throughout the meal grew even softer, fading into the rustle of napkins and the creak of well-used chairs. After dinner, the drawing room welcomed the family back into its cool embrace. Music might fill the room. A pianoforte played gently, never to impress, but to soothe. A daughter might attempt a nocturne, her fingers light, her posture unwavering. The sound drifted upward, circling the chandelier's shadow like rising steam. Conversation took on a different shape in these hours, slower, more inward. Reflections on the day, a passage read aloud, the repetition of familiar stories, all spoken in low tones, with long pauses between. Laughter, if it came, was brief and carefully held. Even in solitude, the end of day followed quiet formality. A man might withdraw to his study, his steps heavy on the carpet, his pipe lit, not for pleasure alone, but to mark the hour. A woman might sit with embroidery in her lap, the needle moving through linen one final time before rest. Children were guided to bed with gentle reminders. No fuss, no refusal. Their nightclothes were already warmed near the fire, slippers placed neatly, the covers turned down by a watchful maid. A prayer was spoken, not hurried, but not prolonged, just enough to still the thoughts and soften the breath. Good night, Mama. Good night, Papa. Doors closed, not with a slam, but a soft click. For the adults, bedtime too was ritual. Hair brushed, hands washed with cold water in porcelain bowls. Rings removed and set carefully on a dish by the side of the bed. The mattress, though firm, offered a kind of order, a place to rest, while the world outside continued its slow turning. The lamps were turned down, one by one. Shadows returned to corners where light had lingered. Outside, the gaslights flickered along the cobbled street, and the only sound might be the slow clip of a carriage, or the bark of a distant dog swallowed by fog. Sleep, in the Victorian world, was not an escape. It was a conclusion, orderly, composed, and private. And as the house settled into its final stillness, with only the clock ticking softly in the hall, it was understood. The rules held even here. Quiet was to be observed. Dreams were to be modest. And rest, like every other part of the day, was to be taken with grace. In the upper rooms of a tall, ivy-framed estate, a woman stood by the window, neither servant nor mistress. She wore a dress of somber cloth, well cut but plain, and in her hand rested a book, its spine worn from use. Her name was Miss Halcombe. She was a governess, and though she moved in silence, the household bent subtly around her. The life of a Victorian governess was one of quiet paradox. She was educated, refined, and trusted with the minds of the young. And yet, she lived between worlds. Not quite family, not quite staff. Her presence was essential, but her role was invisible. Miss Halcombe, like many of her kind, rose early. Long before the lady of the house stirred, she was already at her desk, arranging copybooks, selecting passages from moral tales, preparing a lesson in penmanship. Her mind, steady and unhurried, moved from French verbs to history dates with seamless calm. At breakfast, she ate separately, not with the maids, but not in the dining room either. A small tray in the schoolroom, a cup of weak tea, a corner slice of toast. The quiet hum of her day began not with conversation, but with expectation. She taught 3 daughters of the household, pale girls in white sashes and polished boots. Their manners were gentle, their minds sometimes wandering. Miss Halcombe guided them not with sharpness, but with tone, never raised, never harsh, but firm as the polished oak desk where they wrote their lessons. She corrected posture as much as grammar. A slouched spine earned a gentle reminder, a hasty word, a paused glance. In the afternoons, they practiced sketching. Miss Halcombe had a steady hand, and though she rarely spoke of herself, it was understood she had once studied in Bath, or perhaps London. The truth mattered less than the impression that she carried culture like a soft perfume, something not worn loudly but always present. She rarely spoke of her family. It was whispered that her father had been a clergyman. Others said she was the daughter of a naval captain. What was known was that she wrote long letters on Sundays, quiet pages filled in the same careful script she taught her pupils, and walked alone in the garden, where she examined roses with quiet interest and picked none. At dinner, she remained upstairs, often with a book in her lap. Not a novel, those were for leisure, but something improving, like Fordyce's sermons or a volume of ancient history. The housemaid said she never complained, never raised her voice, and always folded her gloves before placing them in the drawer. And yet, her influence lingered. The girls grew precise in their language, gentle in their movements. They spoke softly to their elders and turned their faces from gossip. And though they would one day marry and forget the smell of chalk or the slow recitation of dates, they would not forget Miss Halcombe, her voice, her bearing, the steady light of her presence. She left eventually, as governesses did. There was no farewell dinner, no great thanks. A small purse was placed into her gloved hands, a note of recommendation, and then she was gone, off to another house, another set of children, another silent corridor. Yet her absence was noticed, in small ways. A dropped please, a lopsided bow. And in those quiet gaps, the household remembered the shape she had held, without ever asking for space. The hedges at Seaforth Manor were always clipped with exacting care. Vines trailed neatly along stone balustrades, and the windows, tall, arched, and ever glinting, looked out upon a world seemingly without disturbance. But even here, behind drawn curtains and polished doors, the quiet rules of society could falter. And when they did, it was never loud. It was a slow spreading stillness, like frost blooming across a pane of glass. The matter at Seaforth did not begin with a cry or confrontation. It began with a note, folded once, sealed without flourish, and delivered by hand to the footman at the front hall. The note was for Mrs. Hensley, the lady of the house, and it arrived without sender or return. She opened it in the drawing room. Her tea remained untouched for the next hour. What followed was not a flurry of accusation or rage. Rather, it was a rearrangement, subtle at first. A guest's invitation was quietly withdrawn. A young woman, her gloves already buttoned for calling, remained upstairs. The butler was told not to expect visitors that week, and the household, without explanation, tilted into silence. Whispers never passed the lips of Mrs. Hensley or her daughters, but in the village below, at the grocer, the chapel, the tailor shop, the story grew. It was said that the youngest Hensley girl had written, perhaps even received, a letter of overly familiar tone. Others said a gentleman caller had arrived without his chaperone, or worse, without hers. No names were printed. The local paper remained quiet, but the scandal moved not in headlines but in glances, shared across pews, between cups of tea, behind closed parlor doors. Victorian propriety, where reputation was as fragile as bone china, the effect was immediate. The girl in question, her name thought to be Clara, did not leave the house for months. Her music lessons were discontinued. Her name appeared neither in engagement announcements nor in church readings. She did not fall ill, yet her complexion paled, and though the doctor called once, perhaps twice, there was no talk of medicine. The scandal was not in what had occurred, but in what was feared. Impropriety, imprudence. The suggestion of misjudgment, however slight, was enough to close doors. Visitors came less often. Conversations paused when family names were mentioned. And within Seaforth Manor, mirrors reflected not just faces, but the cracks of tension too. Yet the rules of conduct remained. No one shouted. No one wept where they could be heard. The household carried on with its orderly routines. Linen aired each Monday, silver polished each Thursday, need to be spoken aloud. Yet the rules of conduct remained. No one shouted. No one wept where they could be heard. The household carried on with its orderly routines. Linen aired each Monday, silver polished each Thursday. But the silence was sharper now. It pressed against each wall and lay folded in the corners of every room. By the following season, the family left for Bath, a temporary relocation, the notice said. For Clara's health, it was suggested. But the village understood. Distance was a salve for wounded reputation, and time, long, uneventful, proper time, might smooth what words had wrinkled. Eventually, another family came to Seaforth. The hedges were clipped, the shutters opened, but the story, soft as it was, remained. It passed like breeze between generations, not named outright, only remembered in pauses. Because in the Victorian world, scandal was never shouted. It was folded, like the note that began it, tucked away, but never entirely gone. She wore black from the edge of her veil to the tips of her gloves, not just in fabric, but in presence. The mourning widow, in Victorian society, moved through her home as if under dimmed light. She did not raise her voice. She did not attend dinners. She did not laugh, even in memory. The loss of a husband was not merely personal. It became public, not in spectacle, but in ritual. The moment of death began a new set of expectations. And for the widow, the world closed in, softly but completely, around her. There were phases to her mourning. each with their own demands. The first year was deep mourning, strict and shadowed. She was to wear crepe, a dull, crinkled fabric that absorbed rather than reflected light. Jewelry was forbidden, save for a small brooch containing the deceased's hair. Invitations were declined without explanation. Windows remained half-shuttered. She might sit for hours in the same room, a handkerchief folded beside her, the air unmoved except for the ticking of a clock or the rattle of the fire. Visitors, if permitted, spoke in low tones. No music was played. No flowers in bright bloom were brought into the house. Even time moved more slowly, as if mourning thickened the very air. After 12 months, if circumstances allowed, the widow entered second mourning. The crepe might be replaced by bombazine, still black, still somber, but with a gentler sheen. She might wear a small locket now, or a jet necklace. Still the rules were clear: no dancing, no theater, no social gatherings, and always her posture remained composed, never bent with visible grief. Mourning did not lift suddenly, but in layers. Even half-mourning, which might come after 2 years, did not permit color beyond gray, lavender, or muted mauve. The transition was slow, not just to respect the departed, but to signal propriety. A woman who mourned too little might be seen as cold. One who mourned too long, pitiable. The balance was delicate. Some widows found in mourning a structure that soothed. The rules gave shape to sorrow, a way to move forward without rushing, to exist without expectation. The black dress, the lowered voice, the withdrawn days, they created a soft retreat from the world's brightness. But for others, it was a quiet prison, a space where grief became performance, where sorrow had to be expressed just so. A slip of color, a moment of laughter, a walk in the garden at the wrong hour, all could be misread. Some widows were young, their lives stretched ahead, full of days no longer shared. And yet, society often offered them only remembrance, not renewal. Remarriage was possible, but rarely swift. And even then, the shadow of mourning never left entirely. The past must be worn quietly, like a second layer of cloth beneath the gown. In the diaries they sometimes kept, widows wrote not only of their loss, but of their stillness. The long days, the letters answered in thin script, the sunsets watched in solitude. They lived, but gently, as if afraid to disturb the silence left behind. She had arrived with quiet shoes and eyes lowered, her hair neatly pinned and her suitcase modest in size. Like many in service, the young maid known only as Alice entered her post at the edge of notice, present enough to work, invisible enough to pass unmentioned. Her days were full of motion, but her presence was expected to leave no trace. Alice worked in the Hensley household, rising before the sun to stoke the kitchen hearth, and ending her hours well after the final embers dimmed. She washed linens in cold water, scrubbed floors on her knees, and dusted corners no one but the head housekeeper would check. Her hands were often raw, her back sore, but she moved as the rules required, quietly, promptly, without comment. She was respectful. She curtsied at the correct times. She kept her apron white, her boots shined, her hair hidden beneath a cap. And yet one morning, she was gone. The staff corridor remained hushed, but there was a gap at the long pine table where she once sat. Her broom leaned silently in the corner. The cook muttered something vague. She had to be let go, and nothing more. No formal notice was given. no accusation. But in the hush of the pantry and the stillness of the back stairs, the story passed in fragments, softened by silence, never confirmed. It was said that Alice had smiled too long at a visiting footman, that she had been seen in the garden after hours, that she had worn a ribbon, once, the wrong color, on a Sunday. Nothing dramatic, nothing provable, just a whisper. In Victorian service, reputation was as brittle as porcelain. One misstep, real or imagined, could crack it entirely. A servant did not have the protections of wealth or name. Her character was built in silence and could be undone by even softer sound. A rumor, even without weight, moved fast. A glance shared in the scullery. A murmured word passed from upper maid to housekeeper. There was no trial, no protest. A tarnished name meant only one thing. A reference would not be provided. Without a reference, the future narrowed. A new position would be harder to find. Respectable homes would hesitate. A life once bound by duty became adrift, and the cause need not even be true. The house did not mourn her. No bed was left unmade. No task went undone. Another girl was hired a week later, quieter, perhaps, with even fewer belongings. Alice's story became, like many of her kind, a shadow, recalled only when others whispered about what might happen if one lingered too long at the front gate, or laughed in the wrong hallway, or met a gaze with too much ease. In a world ruled by stillness, it was not what was said aloud that mattered, but what was never quite denied. The ballroom shimmered like a lantern dream, chandeliers casting pale gold across polished floors, music threading softly through the air, and dresses that rustled like whispered secrets. Beneath the sparkle, however, lay a quiet web of expectations. For a Victorian ball was not just an evening of elegance. It was a stage upon which every movement, glance, and fabric choice was weighed. Eleanor March, the daughter of a gentleman with declining fortunes, arrived to her first season with hope stitched into every hem. Her dress, a pale blue silk edged with embroidered forget-me-nots, had been reworked by candlelight, once her mother's gown, now recut and reimagined. But where others wore gauzy pastels and pearls, Eleanor wore something brighter, not scandalous, not garish, just noticeable. And that, in itself, was enough. The neckline, though modest, was cut slightly wider. The sleeves, gathered with more fullness than current fashion advised. The hem glinted faintly with silver thread, not ostentatious, yet distinct. The effect was immediate. Not in words. No one said anything directly, but eyes lingered longer than usual. A dowager's fan fluttered briefly. A hostess's smile tightened as she nodded toward the girl's gloves. White, yes, but perhaps a shade too pristine. The music began. Dancers moved with graceful precision, each pair following the silent rules of proximity and politeness. Eleanor danced beautifully. Her steps were fluid, her expression calm, and still the dress gleamed, catching light as no other gown in the room dared to. A gentleman asked her for a second dance. He was tall, with well-kept boots and quiet manners. He said nothing unusual. He merely returned as he wished to. But already the chaperones took note. A second dance, unspoken but understood, could be a signa. And the girl in the shimmering dress had now drawn attention twice. The rules were not about restriction alone. They were about balance. to be charming but not too bold, to be beautiful but not too striking, to show interest but only within the space offered. Eleanor, without meaning to, had tipped the scale. By the next day, comments would have begun, softly, always softened. A little forward, perhaps, very sure of herself for a first season. That color, lovely, but not in the best taste. Eleanor would not hear most of it, but she might feel it, in the hesitations, in the invitations that did not come, in the partner who asked only once, in the way other girls smiled but did not include. Her dress had dared to shine, and in doing so, it had stepped just outside the invisible circle drawn around every woman of marriageable age. There was no rulebook, no printed line she had crossed, only the endless code of what was quietly accepted and what was not. She had never intended it to be improper. The letter was brief, carefully written in her most restrained hand. No flourishes, no sentiment, just a few measured lines, thanking him for the book he had lent and remarking quietly that she had found the poem tucked within its pages quite lovely. She did not sign it with her full name, only with her initials, and she did not seal it in wax. Her name was Margaret Ellery, daughter of the village vicar, raised among scripture, stillness, and solemnity. Her father was a kind man, but firm in observance. Her mother, long past, had once sung softly in the garden while she stitched. Margaret remembered those songs, though they were never sung again. The letter had been to Mr. Linton, a quiet man who had returned from London with a tired look and a fondness for Keats. Their conversations were always chaperoned, over tea in the rectory, or while walking to the harvest festival. Always proper, always with others present. There had been no words exchanged that weren't entirely suitable. And yet, a letter, even one so brief, was something else. It was not intercepted, it was received. But someone had seen her give it. A maid, perhaps, or a boy running errands. And by the end of the week, the matter had changed shape. A young woman had written to a gentleman, privately, without permission, without seal. The unsealed letter meant it could be read, and in being readable, it was vulnerable to interpretation, to distortion, to shame. Margaret was not scolded openly. Her father spoke little of it, only instructing that she write no further. His disappointment was not loud, but heavy. He asked her to attend no more visits, and she did not. She felt the shift in the village air. The seamstress grew quieter when measuring her. The grocer's wife stopped asking about her health. Even at church, there was a delay before someone offered to share the hymnal. And Mr. Linton, when next they crossed paths near the stone wall at the lane's end, nodded politely, but said nothing. The rules were not written in books. They were known in glances, silences, and what was not done. A vicar's daughter should not write, not first, not unasked, and certainly not with emotion, however quiet, folded between the lines. Margaret never wrote to him again. The letter, so brief, so innocently sent, was tucked into her desk, between a dried sprig of lavender and a half-used sheet of notepaper. She would look at it once more, many years later, before sealing it at last, not with wax, but with thread. A small act, quiet and unseen, because in the Victorian world, Propriety was not simply about what one did. It was about what one appeared never to consider doing at all. He lived in the far wing of the house, the oldest part, where the floors creaked more loudly and the windows looked out upon the orchard rather than the rose garden. His name was Mr. Archibald Vane, though the children called him Uncle Archie, always in a whisper, as if unsure whether he liked it or not. He was neither stern nor unfriendly, but reserved. He nodded when greeted. He sipped his tea with quiet precision, and he rarely left the house, except for a long walk each afternoon. Same time, same path, same coat, worn smooth at the elbows. He had never married. In a world where adulthood was defined by marriage and inheritance, this fact made him stand apart. He had no family of his own, no household staff, no correspondence from a spouse abroad. Only books, ledgers, and the soft sound of a watch chain settling into his vest pocket as he sat down each evening. There was no scandal tied to him, no whispered disgrace, only the quiet question that lingered whenever his name was mentioned. Why not? In Victorian society, a bachelor could exist within the fold, accepted, even useful, but always slightly outside the rhythm. He was expected to be courteous, but never too familiar. Present, but not central. Uncle Archie played his part well. At dinner, he offered polite conversation, safe topics, spoken gently, weather, trade, the turn of the harvest. He never spoke of feelings, nor asked after others, unless in the expected way. And how is your health? Is the young one progressing in Latin? But he never lingered on answers. He gave gifts at Christmas time, all thoughtfully chosen, a puzzle box for one niece, a volume of poetry for another. He never explained how he knew their tastes. He simply seemed to remember. No one knew the full shape of his past. There had once been a photograph in a silver frame, now turned inward on the bookshelf, and a blue silk ribbon kept in the drawer beside his glasses. But he did not speak of them, and no one asked. In a society that prized roles, husband, father, benefactor, Uncle Archie was something else, the quiet observer, the unanchored branch of a deeply rooted tree. He bore it well, but sometimes, when the family gathered in the garden, and he remained behind, one might glimpse him at the window, watching from behind the curtain's edge. He was not lonely, or if he was, he wore it gently. For Victorian men, silence was not necessarily sadness. It was often decorum. And a man who lived alone, who spoke little, who passed his years in the company of books and quiet order, was simply part of the pattern, like the ticking clock on the mantel or the untouched chair in the corner of the parlor. He was always there. And then, quietly, one day, he was not. Each Thursday, at 3:30, the front drawing room filled with the careful sound of scales. Fingers stumbled over keys that had been played by generations before, and the tall windows overlooked a garden that rarely changed. The music teacher arrived precisely on time, always dressed in a coat just a touch too warm for the season, and carrying a worn leather case that clicked shut with a practiced hand. His name was Mr. Alton. Never James, never Sir. Simply Mr. Alton, as though the name itself were part of the lesson. He was a man of few expressions. He bowed slightly upon arrival, removed his gloves without flourish, and set about tuning the piano before speaking a word. His instruction was gentle but firm, and the girls adored him for it, not in any grand or romantic way, but in the manner young minds admire steady kindness. Each Thursday at 3:30, the front drawing room filled with the careful sound of scales. Fingers stumbled over keys that had been played by generations before, and the tall windows overlooked a garden that rarely changed. The music teacher arrived precisely on time, always dressed in a coat just a touch too warm for the season, and carrying a worn leather case that clicked shut with a practiced hand. His name was Mr. Alton, never James, never Sir, simply Mr. Alton, as though the name itself were part of the lesson. He was a man of few expressions. He bowed slightly upon arrival, removed his gloves without flourish, and set about tuning the piano before speaking a word. His instruction was gentle but firm, and the girls adored him for it, not in any grand or romantic way, but in the manner young minds admire steady kindness. For 2 years, he taught the daughters of the Faircombe family, modest folk of good standing, their home filled with quiet hallways and lace-curtained windows. He guided their fingers over Mozart, over Handel, and eventually to simpler pieces of their own choosing. He never strayed from his place beside the instrument, never ate in the house, never stayed past the hour, until one Thursday, when a storm broke overhead just as the lesson ended. The eldest girl, her music book still open, asked if he might wait just until the rain eased. Her mother had already retired upstairs. The fire had been lit. It seemed only polite, and so he remained. He sat in the corner chair, accepted the tea that was offered, spoke softly of his days studying in Oxford, though none could say whether this was fact or careful fiction. The rain slowed. He stayed still, and by the time he rose to leave, the clock had struck 5:30. It was the delay that changed everything. The servants noticed. One spoke to another. The mother, when she returned to the room, found it oddly quiet. No laughter, no discomfort, but something lingering. The man had stayed past the natural boundary. No fault was visible, no words spoken out of place. But he had stayed, and in the Victorian world, that was enough. By the following Thursday, his services were no longer required. The excuse was polite. A shift in schedule, a new instructor, more suited to examination needs. He bowed, accepted the dismissal, and said nothing more. He did not return. The family never spoke ill of him. Yet in the village, where patterns are watched more closely than words, the tale took on shape. He lingered, they said. He overstayed. A man alone, you must be cautious. For in Victorian society, the rules were unwritten and the borders invisible. But to cross them, even gently, was to mark oneself. He gave no protest, no explanation, only silence. The case clicked shut one final time, and Mr. Alton was folded into memory like so many others. His name spoken only in passing. His presence marked not by scandal, but by the subtle shiver of impropriety that had passed too close to notice, until it had already settled in. It was not a grand gate, just a narrow iron frame, half overgrown with honeysuckle, that opened from the side of the rectory garden onto a lesser-used lane. It squeaked faintly when moved, a tired little sound that no one paid attention to, until, one afternoon, it was found ajar. The lane itself was quiet. It wound through hedges and old trees, past cottages and stone walls, a place for errands, or a stroll when one did not wish to be seen. And for the girls of the house, it had always been forbidden, not with force, but with firm suggestion. Use the front, their father would say, better to be seen properly. But 15-year-old Lydia had left the garden through the side gate. Not far, not long, just a few minutes' walk, or perhaps a little more. She carried a basket with embroidery tucked inside, and wore gloves, though her hat was forgotten. And someone, perhaps the grocer's wife or a passing curate, had seen her turn back in from the lane with flushed cheeks and hurried steps. There had been no scandal, no meeting, no company, no trace of wrongdoing. But she had used the gate, alone, unchaperoned, unobserved. In the days that followed, nothing was said outright. The gate was found closed again, tied with a short length of twine. Lydia was kept inside more often, her errands reassigned to the maid. The afternoon walks, once regular and pleasant, were suddenly absent. At church, her name was not mentioned in the same tone. Growing up quickly, someone whispered, needs firm guidance. The mistake had been small, hardly a mistake at all by modern measure, but in the unyielding logic of Victorian propriety. The issue was not what had happened, but what might have. Because the world outside the gate was full of possibility, and possibility for a girl on the edge of womanhood was dangerous when unwatched. One open gate could suggest many things. A meeting, a letter, a secret. And in a time when a young woman's worth was measured not in character alone, but in how tightly she held to silence and routine, even the softest detour could echo. Lydia never used the gate again. She passed it many times, basket in hand, bonnet properly tied, but her eyes did not linger on it. She never spoke of where she had gone or why. Perhaps even she did not know. The gate had simply beckoned. Years later, she would remember it not as a moment of disobedience, but as the last time she had walked without thought, without watchfulness, the moment before the weight of custom settled fully across her shoulders. The gate remained, rusted, then mended, then painted once more. But it was never left open again. It was a crisp afternoon in late spring, the kind of day when the sun rests gently on the tops of hedgerows, and the scent of new blossoms lingers in the corridors of country homes. In the sitting room of the Halberton residence, Miss Isabel sat with her aunt, darning a small tear in her glove. The lace curtains fluttered lightly, and from the drawing-room came the distant sound of the mantel clock, counting moments in quiet rhythm. They had been expecting a visitor, Mr. Edgar Bellamy, the son of a distant relation, a man of good manners and acceptable standing. He had dined with the family once the month prior, had conversed amiably with the aunt about the state of the London railways, and had asked, with measured politeness, whether he might call again. Permission had been granted, in the unspoken way of these things, and tea had been prepared in anticipation of his arrival, but he did not knock. Instead, the front door, left slightly ajar by the boy sent to fetch coal, was nudged open by a draught, or so it seemed, and Mr. Bellamy stepped inside. Not into the entrance hall, not into the parlor with a servant to guide him, but into the sitting room directly. He had meant no harm. He had simply heard voices and approached. Isabel rose to her feet. Her aunt set down her needlework, and in the stillness that followed, something irrevocable happened. He had not knocked. He had crossed the boundary between propriety and presumption, not loudly, not rudely, but decisively, and though no raised voices followed, no protest or scandal, the lines had shifted. He apologized, of course, stepped back, adjusted his cravat, asked for forgiveness. He was offered tea, conversation resumed, but it had changed. The warmth had gone out of it. And when he took his leave, bowing precisely as expected, no invitation to return was extended. Later that evening, the matter was discussed quietly between Isabel's aunt and her father. They spoke of respect, of instincts, of hesitation, and it was gently decided that perhaps Mr. Bellamy, though well-intentioned, was not quite suitable. His name was not spoken unkindly, only with regret, and Isabel, who had looked forward to his visit, said nothing. She simply folded the glove she had been mending and placed it into her drawer. In the weeks that followed, he did not write, nor did he return. He had understood, for in the Victorian world, even so small a breach, a doorway crossed without the expected formality, could be enough. A gentleman caller was not merely judged by what he said or gave, but by the space he held and how carefully he approached it. A knock was more than habit. It was signal, permission, a ritual of respect. And to forego it, however innocently, was to speak out of turn in a language made entirely of quiet rules. In the cellars beneath many Victorian townhouses, below the polished floors and behind the plastered walls, lived an entire world mostly unseen. The servants who moved through these lower corridors left behind few records, fewer portraits, and even fewer names remembered. Yet they were there, early each morning and long after others had gone to bed. In grand homes, a servant might never be seen at all. Bell pulls and speaking tubes kept contact to a minimum. Meals were laid out in silence. Fires tended before dawn. Clothing appeared pressed and arranged, yet the hands that prepared them remained in the shadows. These were the invisible threads holding the household together. Their rooms were narrow, their belongings few. A pair of worn slippers, a comb, a single cracked teacup. Yet within these quiet spaces, laughter occasionally rose. Jokes passed in whispers. A song hummed while polishing silver. There was life, though not often witnessed. Their schedules were carved by custom. Boots blacked before sunrise. Coals carried by hand. The scraping of ash from grates, always done before the mistress rose. There was no alarm clock, only the rhythm of habit honed by years. And with them came rules, not written in books or pinned to walls, but in posture, in silence. Never sit in the drawing room. Never speak unless spoken to. Never answer the door in anything less than your full uniform, regardless of how tired your feet might be. If a mistake was made, a dropped tray, a letter misdelivered, it might pass unnoticed, or it might not. A single misstep could mean dismissal. No letter of reference, no warning, and still, most endured. Because behind the wallpapered calm of Victorian life, behind every buttoned glove and drawn curtain, there were those who swept the ashes and turned the keys, forgotten by history, perhaps, but not by the echo of their footsteps, still faintly heard on stone floors. She arrived without ceremony, often in the night, carrying a leather satchel and a face worn by years of watching pain pass into relief. The midwife was not a doctor. She wore no uniform, but in many homes, especially those not grand enough for private physicians, she was the first voice a newborn heard. Her presence was tolerated upstairs, but vital downstairs. She knew the birthing chairs, the folded linens, the boiled water, and the fragile line between life and loss. She did not raise her voice. She worked in dim rooms and left quietly when her task was done. Among the poor, her work was urgent and constant. Among the wealthy, it was hidden. She entered through servant doors. Her name rarely appeared in family letters. Birth, though sacred, was spoken of in vague terms. Confined, they said, or simply indisposed. She knew secrets of stillborn children, of early labors, of daughters sent to the countryside for a rest, only to return with none the wiser. She never, too, not because she was asked, but because silence was part of the work, just the memory of all the lives she had once held. It began with a black ribbon, tied tightly around the wrist or pinned to a dress. But in Victorian society, mourning was not merely a state of feeling. It was a structured ritual, and its symbols often took delicate gleaming form. Mourning jewelry spoke for the grief that could not be named aloud. A brooch with a lock of hair. A locket etched with initials and tiny dates. A ring worn on a different finger. Heavier than it seemed. Each piece was a code, not of vanity, but of remembrance. Black enamel, jet beads, and seed pearls appeared most often in these pieces, each material chosen carefully. Jet, cut from fossilized wood, was favored for its somber glow. Pearls, the tears of the sea, often adorned jewelry for children lost too young. Some wore pieces containing woven strands of the departed's hair, bound into delicate patterns beneath glass. Far from morbid, this was considered tender, a way to keep part of the loved one near. But such adornments were not eternal. They had a timeline. Full mourning might last a year, marked by strict dress and solemnity. Then came half mourning, softer colors, lighter tones, and the slow reintroduction of daily life. To abandon the jewelry too soon was frowned upon. To wear it too long suggested one could not move forward. The balance, as always, was fragile. The trinkets were passed down in silence, worn occasionally, then wrapped in cloth, stored in drawers with pressed flowers and old letters, symbols of love, loss, and the social rules that governed even sorrow. And somewhere, inside those rings and lockets, lingered the quiet weight of names no longer spoken, but never entirely gone. The parlor was not merely a room, it was a ritual, a carefully arranged space where sunlight filtered through lace curtains, and every object had its proper place, from the porcelain dog on the mantel to the teacups that clinked just once, politely, before being sipped in silence. This was where visitors were received, where conversations were tested for tone, and where women of the house enacted the most intricate of social performances. To pour the tea too quickly was to appear rushed. To offer the wrong order, milk before or after, was noted. Not necessarily judged aloud, but remembered. Chairs were positioned for maximum civility. Eye contact was brief. Every exchange had a rhythm. The inquiry after one's health, the mutual appreciation of the weather, and the careful circling around topics too impolite to name. One might discuss the vicar's sermon, but not the political pamphlet folded inside a guest's coat. Here, laughter was permitted, soft, melodic, and never too long. Opinions, if offered, came lightly cloaked in suggestion. Some might say, or it's often thought, a direct remark could ring too loudly, and always the clock ticked steadily in the background, a reminder that even leisure was kept under rules. One did not linger too long. One never arrived too early. A 10-minute visit might mean favor. A 40-minute stay risked over-familiarity. Yet behind all this polish lay tension, social rank, suitability, respectability. The teacup became a kind of mask, delicate, controlled, and always in hand. The parlor, for all its cushions and soft tones, was not a place for rest, but rehearsal. And when the final sip was taken and the guest had gone, a silence settled over the room. Not relief, not regret, just stillness, as if the performance had ended and the furniture could breathe once more. To be spoken of, delicately, approvingly, and from a safe distance, was one of the unspoken aims of Victorian social life, not in a loud or boastful way, but through quiet remarks at luncheons, nods exchanged during walks, or letters sent between aunts and cousins with folded corners and barely their ink. She carries herself well, one might say. You know, she's managing the household entirely on her own now. Or simply, there's something steady in her presence. Such phrases were currency, subtle acknowledgments that a woman, or a family, was moving along the invisible current of acceptance. Of course, the inverse was also true. She's grown very modern in her thinking, someone might remark, lips barely parted. Or that hat, though beautifully made, is rather striking for a girl of her age. These were not insults, not quite. They were cues, softened by tone and lace gloves. Reputation in the Victorian world was not built by achievement alone. It was preserved by the absence of error, by being unremarkable in all the correct ways. A well-placed silence could say as much as any sentence. If a name was not mentioned when it should have been, that too was a signal. Doors could close softly. Invitations might slow. A seat at the dinner table, once reliably set, might go unused. Men were not immune. Their fortunes, their company, their perceived respectability could lift or diminish a household. A quiet word about debts, an unanswered letter, a misplaced laugh in mixed company, all could gently tilt the scales. And so, to be spoken of, favorably, mildly, respectfully, was not simply a social bonus. It was survival. A delicate art of presence without disruption, of being known without being too noticeable. Those who mastered it were remembered kindly, and those who did not simply faded from the parlor conversations, as if they had never quite arrived. She stood behind the counter of the milliner's shop, hands clasped neatly in front of her, her gloves pale and carefully mended where the seam had split just days before. She was not a customer. She was not from a family of standing. She was simply employed. Miss Edith Grace, a name seldom spoken by those who bought the fine hats and ribbon bonnets she carefully arranged. To the ladies who entered, she was a blur, quiet, efficient, pleasing in posture. She spoke only when required, and never first. But that afternoon, a young gentleman paused. He had entered accompanying his sister, a bright-eyed girl with a laugh, too loud for the room's soft hush. He trailed behind her, uninterested, until his gaze settled on Edith, and for a moment, just long enough to be remembered, he looked directly at her and smiled. She did not smile back. She lowered her eyes. But the pause between them had already broken the expected rhythm. Later, his sister purchased a modest hat, tipped the girl behind the counter with an absent flick of the wrist, and left. The door closed. The air shifted. Two of the other girls noticed. No words were exchanged. But when Edith returned to the back room, folding tissue paper with extra care, she knew that something had changed. A glance in public could be many things: innocent, curious, kind. But it could also suggest a familiarity not allowed between classes. In the weeks that followed, she was watched more closely, asked to take the quieter shifts, given fewer customers to assist. Nothing overt, nothing cruel, just a soft withdrawal. Because in the Victorian world, a shop girl's respectability rested not just in her work, but in her distance, her invisibility. A glance that lingered too long could unravel the threads that held her station together. The gloves she wore grew older. She stitched them once more and never looked up again. The knock at the door came just after 4, a time considered respectable, though near the outer edge of the proper calling window. The maid, startled from polishing the banister, wiped her hands and went to answer. Standing on the stoop was a man in a dark coat, neither finely dressed nor disheveled. His expression was polite, his posture appropriate. But when asked for his card, he hesitated. "I'm calling on Mr. Barrington," he said, "on a matter of business." And yet he offered no card. There was a pause, a quiet intake of breath. In Victorian households, the calling card was more than paper. It was a ritual of entry, a formal introduction, a boundary marker. To arrive without one was to step outside the pattern, however neatly dressed, however well-spoken. The maid, unsure, offered to inquire. She closed the door gently behind her. Upstairs, the parlor fell quiet as the message was delivered. Mr. Barrington, retired colonel, upright and particular, frowned ever so slightly. "No card?" he repeated. "No, sir." "Then no appointment," he replied, after a moment's pause. "He may try again another day." The message was sent back. The man nodded, turned, and left without protest. No one ever learned his business. It was not personal. It was not cruel. It was simply the code. For the Victorian social world, form preceded content. The card said, "I am known." Without it, a visitor was a question unanswered, a door unopened, no matter how softly he knocked. And by evening, the incident had already begun to dissolve into the rhythm of the household. The fire was stirred, the tea was poured. The world returned to its quiet order, where every introduction must be offered before the first word is ever spoken. It was just a spoon, small, silver, and delicate, one of 6 that had belonged to Mrs. Weatherstone's grandmother, kept in a velvet-lined box at the back of the sideboard. They were not used daily, only for special guests, only when everything on the table must shimmer. One afternoon, during the early hours of tidying, the youngest maid, Clara, was dusting the dining room cabinet. She worked quietly, sleeves rolled above the wrist, her breath soft, so as not to disturb the arrangement of polished plates and glass. When she finished, she returned her cloth and carried a tray of polish-stained linens down to the scullery. No one noticed anything amiss, not at first. It wasn't until Sunday that the spoon was discovered missing. Not all six, just one. There was no scene. Only a few carefully chosen questions. When had the cabinet last been opened? Who had cleaned? Had anyone come into the room unannounced? Clara was summoned. Her hands shook. She said she had done as she always did. Nothing more. They searched her room, her apron pocket, her trunk. Nothing. Still, the spoon was gone. And in the hush of that drawing room, it was decided that it would be best, said with a gentle tone, as though to comfort her, if she were released from service. No police were called, no accusations shouted, but Clara left by the week's end. The other maids watched as she packed her small bag, eyes lowered, not daring to speak. Months later, the spoon was found. It had slipped behind the lining of the cabinet, wedged in a narrow crevice, dulled by time. No announcement was made. The item was polished and placed back in its case. Life continued, but Clara did not return, and her name was never mentioned again in that house, because in the Victorian world, doubt itself could tarnish a reputation, and sometimes that was harder to remove than the tarnish on silver. The lawn had been raked just that morning, and rows of folding chairs stood in quiet order, beneath trees heavy with late summer leaves. On the long tables, lemon cakes rested beside small pots of jam, and parasols bloomed gently across the garden like pastel-colored flowers. The event was the Langford Garden Afternoon, an annual gathering known less for its conversation and more for its subtle choreography of presence and absence. Guests moved slowly, gloves smoothed, fans fluttered, children curtsied and were then sent to play out of earshot. It was the sort of occasion where nothing truly happened, and yet everything could be read in the details. And so it did not go unnoticed when Miss Helena Fielding passed by Mr. Edmund Hale without offering the slightest bow. They were not close acquaintances, but their families had dined in the same circles. He had once offered her his chair during a church recital. There had been, at least, enough familiarity to merit acknowledgement. But her gaze drifted past him as if he were merely a part of the hedgerow, not cruelly, not even coldly, just absent, as if he no longer existed in the script of the afternoon. The onlookers noticed, not openly, but in the soft change of posture, in the pause before the next sip of tea. The moment passed, but the memory stayed. Later, it was said that she had grown too proud, or that perhaps he had said something unwise at a supper weeks earlier. No one knew, and neither ever spoke of it. But from that day on, their names no longer appeared in the same column of the guest list. Because in Victorian society, omission could be louder than offense. A missed bow, a turned head, a silence that lasted too long. These were not just accidents. They were decisions, layered beneath civility like the stitching beneath a hem. And for those who understood the language, such small gestures shaped the boundaries of belonging. One glance at a time. The curtains in the rear sitting room were seldom drawn. They hung beside the tall sash windows, thick with dust at the hem, framing the garden view with faded florals that once echoed the wallpaper. It was a quiet room, unused except on Sundays or when a guest preferred privacy. But one late afternoon, while airing out the space, a maid noticed something out of place. A piece of folded paper, wedged neatly between the window ledge and the drapery lining. Not large, not damaged, simply hidden. Inside was a pencil sketch, careful, detailed, and surprisingly fine. It showed a woman seated, one gloved hand resting in her lap, her profile turned slightly away. Her bonnet was rendered with such precision that it must have been drawn from life. And there was something else. It was Miss Eleanor, the daughter of the house. Not scandalous, not immodest, but private, too intimate for the drawing to have been done with permission. Her likeness, unguarded, captured in a moment of calm the world was never meant to see. Who had drawn it was never determined. A tutor, perhaps, a cousin, a guest from a past visit, but the drawing was not signed, only dated in the corner, March 12th. The mistress of the house was informed. No scene was made. The drawing was folded again and placed in an envelope. And by the following week, the tutor no longer came. No explanation, no farewell. Eleanor herself never asked about it. If she had known, she said nothing. But for weeks afterward, she lingered less often near the window. Because in a world where expression was bound by rule, and art was meant to follow proper channels, even a drawing, especially one done in secret, could become a breach. The curtains were drawn tighter after that. The room remained undisturbed, and the envelope, quietly sealed, was never spoken of again. As our journey draws softly to a close, imagine yourself settling deeper into comfort, perhaps resting your head against a soft pillow or wrapped gently in a favorite blanket. The world outside grows quieter, and here, in this quiet space, time slows. We have wandered through rooms and gardens, through whispered conversations and measured steps. We have glimpsed the rhythms of Victorian life, the careful balance of appearance and restraint, the silent language of gloves and glances, the steady pulse of social rules that shaped days and nights alike. Remember, too, that these stories are more than history. They are echoes, faint and gentle, of lives lived with care, with dignity, and with unspoken grace. A world where silence was as meaningful as speech, where the smallest gesture could carry the weight of respect. Now, as you rest, allow these echoes to fade softly into your mind like the last notes of a lullaby. The past, with all its strictures and rituals, blends into the calm present, where you are safe, where you are free. At what time are you listening to this moment of quiet history? Whether morning, afternoon, or late into the night, may this gentle retelling from Historian Couch bring you peace. Thank you for sharing this journey through the delicate intricacies of Victorian social rules. May your dreams be calm and your rest deep. Historian Couch signs off.